Wealthy man humiliates his housekeeper. The next day, she's in a luxury car he can't afford. The crystal glasses shattered into countless pieces, each shard scattering across the marble floor of the grand estate. The room fell silent as the guests turned their attention toward the source of the disruption. Maria knelt instinctively, her hands trembling as she reached for the largest pieces, hoping to gather them quickly before anyone said anything. Her head remained bowed, but she could feel their eyes on her. "Unbelievable," Robert Sterling said, his voice sharp and cutting. He stood at the center of the gathering, dressed in a custom-tailored suit that screamed wealth and power. His arms were crossed, and his expression was one of exaggerated disbelief. "How hard is it to carry a tray of glasses without dropping them?" Maria's throat tightened, but she kept her gaze down. "I'm sorry, Mr. Sterling," she said softly, her voice almost drowned out by the murmurs of the guests. "Sorry?" Robert repeated, his tone mocking. "You're always sorry, Maria. But sorry doesn't fix broken glass, or my reputation. Do you know how much these glasses cost? Probably more than your monthly paycheck." Laughter rippled through the crowd. Maria's cheeks burned, but she remained composed, carefully picking up the fragments and placing them onto the tray. She wasn't new to Robert's insults, but the sting never faded. Each comment chipped away at the shield of dignity she tried to maintain. "Just clean this up and get out of the way," Robert added, waving a dismissive hand. "You're embarrassing yourself." Maria nodded, biting the inside of her cheek to keep her emotions in check. She stood slowly, holding the tray close to her chest as she walked out of the room. Her steps were quiet, deliberate, as if she could will herself to disappear into the background. The sound of laughter and the clinking of glasses faded behind her as she made her way to the kitchen. Once alone, she set the tray down and leaned against the counter, taking a deep breath. The humiliation was suffocating, but Maria had learned to endure it. It was all for her daughter, Sophia. Every demeaning comment, every long hour, every night spent cleaning up after Robert's extravagant parties, it was for Sophia. She had no other choice. Maria glanced at the clock. The night was far from over. She straightened up, wiped her hands on her apron, and prepared to return to the party. As she stepped back into the hallway, she overheard Robert's booming voice. "These people," he was saying, his tone dripping with disdain. "They think they can just show up, collect a paycheck, and call it a day. No ambition, no vision. That's why they stay at the bottom." Maria paused, her hands tightening into fists. She knew better than to respond, but the words sank deep into her chest. She had ambition. She had vision. But life hadn't been kind to her, and circumstances had forced her into this role. Still, she refused to let his words define her. She would prove him wrong, if not today then someday. The hours dragged on, and Maria worked silently, avoiding Robert and his guests. By the time the party ended, it was well past midnight. She collected her things, wrapped a scarf around her shoulders, and stepped out into the chilly night air. Her small apartment was a 20-minute walk from the estate, and though she was exhausted, she welcomed the quiet. At home, Sophia was fast asleep on the couch, her schoolbooks spread out on the coffee table. Maria smiled softly and gently lifted her daughter, carrying her to bed. After tucking her in, Maria sat down at the kitchen table, flipping open the worn notebook she kept tucked away in her bag. Inside were pages of notes, calculations, sketches, and ideas she had jotted down over the years. Maria had always been good with numbers, a natural talent she had honed in her brief time studying finance before she had to drop out of college. Her dream of becoming an investment analyst had been put on hold indefinitely, but she had never stopped learning. Tonight, as she stared at her notes, a new determination filled her. Robert's words echoed in her mind. No ambition, no vision. He was wrong. She had plenty of both. She just needed the right opportunity. Maria flipped to a fresh page and began writing. Her pen moved quickly, fueled by the spark of an idea that had been lingering in the back of her mind. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The next morning, Maria returned to the estate, her uniform freshly pressed and her head held high. Robert was already in the living room, sipping coffee and reviewing papers with his assistant. "Maria," he said without looking up, "make sure the kitchen is spotless before you leave today. We're hosting another dinner tomorrow, and I don't want any surprises." "Of course, Mr. Sterling," Maria replied evenly, hiding the resentment she felt. She turned toward the kitchen, but as she walked away, she couldn't help but overhear snippets of their conversation. "This merger is going to make us a fortune," Robert was saying. "By the time it's finalized, we'll have the market cornered. No one will be able to touch us." Maria's ears perked up. She didn't know much about Robert's business dealings, but she had overheard enough over the years to know they were lucrative. Still, something about his tone gave her pause. He sounded overconfident, almost reckless. As she worked, Maria thought about what she had heard. She didn't understand the specifics, but the idea of a merger piqued her curiosity. That evening, after putting Sophia to bed, Maria did something she hadn't done in a long time. She opened her laptop and started researching. The internet was a treasure trove of information, and Maria quickly found articles and reports about Robert's company. The merger he had mentioned was all over the news, touted as a game-changer for the industry. But as Maria read more, she noticed something the articles didn't focus on: potential vulnerabilities in the deal. She stayed up late into the night, cross-referencing data and taking notes. The more she read, the more certain she became that Robert was overlooking something important. She didn't know exactly what yet, but her instincts told her there was an opportunity hidden in the details. By the time the sun rose, Maria had a plan forming in her mind. It was bold, maybe even reckless, but she couldn't shake the feeling that this was her chance to change everything, not just for herself but for Sophia too. Maria sat at the kitchen table, the glow of her laptop illuminating her face as the early morning sunlight began streaming through the window. Her research from the night before had unearthed a peculiar detail about the merger Robert was so confident in. The deal hinged on acquiring a smaller company that controlled a vital piece of technology. Without it, the merger wouldn't go through and Robert's plan to dominate the market would collapse. She couldn't stop thinking about it. The smaller company's stock was undervalued, and Maria's limited knowledge of finance told her that this was an opportunity. But what could she do? She wasn't a player in the financial world. She was a housekeeper, scraping together every penny to make ends meet. Still, the thought lingered as she got Sophia ready for school. "Mama," Sophia asked, her big brown eyes curious, "why are you so quiet today?" Maria smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her daughter's face. "Just thinking, my love." "Always thinking." After Sophia left for school, Maria pulled out her notebook and started sketching ideas. Her hand moved quickly, fueled by a mix of determination and frustration. Robert's words from the party replayed in her mind. No ambition. No vision. He had no idea who she really was, what she was capable of. She wasn't just going to prove him wrong, she was going to change her life. Back at the estate, Robert was in rare form. He barked orders at his staff, preparing for yet another dinner party to impress potential investors. Maria worked quietly in the background as always, but this time she was listening more closely than usual. "The deal's practically sealed," Robert boasted to his assistant. "It's just a matter of time before we acquire the patents. Then it's game over for everyone else." Maria pretended to dust a nearby shelf, her ears attuned to every word. She had learned over the years that people like Robert often dismissed the presence of help as insignificant, as though she didn't have ears or a brain. It worked to her advantage now. When the assistant left the room, Robert turned his attention to Maria. "Make sure the dining room is spotless," he said, not even bothering to look at her. "And for God's sake, don't drop anything this time." "Yes, Mr. Sterling," Maria replied, her voice steady. She had mastered the art of hiding her emotions, even when her blood boiled. That evening, after finishing her shift, Maria returned home and opened her laptop again. Her savings account wasn't impressive, but it was something. She had spent years putting away small amounts whenever she could, dreaming of a better future for Sophia. Now she wondered if this could be the moment to put those savings to use. Her research had led her to a small brokerage platform that allowed people to buy and sell stocks. Maria hesitated, her finger hovering over the trackpad. What if she was wrong? What if she lost everything? But then she thought of Sophia, of the life she wanted to provide for her daughter. She couldn't let fear hold her back. Taking a deep breath, Maria transferred her savings into the brokerage account. The amount wasn't much, but it was enough to buy a small stake in the company Robert needed for his merger. She placed the order and sat back, her heart racing. "This is just the beginning," she whispered to herself. The next day at the estate, Maria carried on as usual. She polished silverware, arranged flowers, and served drinks to Robert's guests, all while keeping her thoughts carefully hidden. But beneath her composed exterior, a storm of emotions raged. She had taken a risk, a massive one, and now she had to wait and see if it would pay off. As the dinner party progressed, Maria found herself back in the kitchen, preparing to bring out dessert. She could hear snippets of conversation from the dining room. "What about the smaller company?" one of the guests asked. "Are they on board with the deal?" "They don't have a choice," Robert replied confidently. "Once we finalize the terms, they'll have no leverage. It's all but done." Maria smirked to herself. He had no idea how wrong he was. Over the next few days, Maria checked her brokerage account obsessively. The stock she had invested in began to climb, slowly at first, then more quickly as rumors of the merger gained traction. Maria's small stake grew in value, and with each passing day her confidence grew alongside it. But she knew this wasn't just about making money. It was about gaining leverage, about proving to herself, and to Robert, that she was more than he ever gave her credit for. By the end of the week, the stock price had surged to levels Maria hadn't dared to dream of. Her modest savings had multiplied, giving her a small but meaningful fortune. She didn't know whether to laugh or cry. For the first time in years, she felt like she had control over her life. The following morning, Maria arrived at the estate earlier than usual. She parked her car, a well-used sedan, in the staff lot and made her way inside. Robert was already in his office, shouting into his phone. "What do you mean the shares aren't available?" he barked. "Who's buying them?" Maria smiled to herself as she passed by. She knew exactly who had been buying the shares. Later that day, as Robert prepared for yet another investor meeting, Maria approached him with an envelope in hand. "Mr. Sterling," she said, her tone calm but firm. "I need a moment of your time." Robert looked up, annoyed. "What is it now?" Maria placed the envelope on his desk. "You'll want to read this." He opened the envelope and pulled out a single sheet of paper. His eyes scanned the text, and for the first time, Maria saw a flicker of uncertainty in his expression. "What is this?" he demanded. "It's a formal notice," Maria explained. "I've acquired a significant stake in the company you're trying to merge with. That means I have a say in the deal." Robert stared at her, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. "You? What are you talking about? You're my housekeeper." "Not anymore," Maria said, her voice steady. "I'm a shareholder now. And I think we need to have a serious conversation about the future of this deal." For a moment, Robert was too stunned to speak. Then, as the realization sank in, his expression darkened. "You think you can just walk in here and—" "I think," Maria interrupted, "that you've underestimated me for too long. But that's your problem, not mine." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving Robert to process what had just happened. The power dynamic between them had shifted irrevocably, and Maria couldn't help but feel a sense of triumph. The boardroom was tense as the meeting adjourned. Robert clenched his fists, his polished demeanor cracking under the strain of his mounting frustration. Maria's calm presence had shifted the dynamics in a way he hadn't anticipated. She had not only asked the right questions but also managed to plant seeds of doubt about the merger's terms. The board members were now re-evaluating the entire deal, something Robert had never seen coming. As the board members filtered out of the room, Maria gathered her notes and rose from her seat. Robert lingered, waiting until the others had left before approaching her. His steps were measured, but his eyes burned with restrained anger. "You think you've won something here?" Robert said, his voice low but sharp. "This isn't over, Maria. You don't belong in this world." Maria turned to face him, her expression unwavering. "That's where you're wrong, Mr. Sterling. I've spent years cleaning up after people like you, listening to your deals, your boasts, and your insults. I understand this world more than you think." Robert's jaw tightened, but Maria didn't stop. "You're right about one thing, though. This isn't over. It's just the beginning." Without waiting for a response, Maria walked out of the boardroom, her head held high. Every step felt like a victory, a reclaiming of the dignity she had fought so hard to preserve. That evening, Maria returned home to Sophia, who greeted her at the door with a hug. "Mama, you're home early?" Sophia said, her face lighting up with excitement. Maria smiled and knelt to Sophia's level. "I had an important meeting today and it went well. How was school?" Sophia launched into a story about her day, her words tumbling over one another in her enthusiasm. Maria listened, her heart full. No matter what challenges she faced, moments like these reminded her why she was doing all of this. Everything she fought for was for Sophia's future. As Sophia went to bed, Maria sat at the kitchen table and opened her laptop. Her inbox was filled with messages, some from Davidson and other board members, others from investors curious about her growing influence. She responded thoughtfully, knowing that every word she wrote carried weight. One email stood out. It was from a journalist requesting an interview about her journey. Maria hesitated. She wasn't used to being in the spotlight, and the idea of sharing her story made her uneasy. But then she thought about the other housekeepers, waitresses, and workers like her who had been dismissed and underestimated. Maybe her story could inspire them. She typed out a response. "I'd be happy to speak. Let me know when works for you." The next day, Robert doubled down on his efforts to regain control. He called an emergency meeting with his legal team, demanding options to bypass Maria's influence. "There has to be a loophole," he growled. "Something we can use to push her out." One of the lawyers hesitated before speaking. "Sir, Maria's position is secure. The shares she owns give her full voting rights, and her questions during the last meeting have raised valid concerns. The board is listening to her now." Robert slammed his fist on the table. "She's a housekeeper. How did this happen?" "Perhaps that's why it happened," the lawyer said carefully. "You underestimated her." The room fell silent. Robert's face darkened, but he knew the lawyer was right. His arrogance had blinded him, and now he was paying the price. Meanwhile, Maria's influence continued to grow. She met with Davidson and other board members to discuss alternatives to the merger, proposing ideas that would strengthen the company without sacrificing its autonomy. Her insights were practical and forward-thinking, earning her respect even from those who had initially dismissed her. One afternoon, as Maria left a meeting, Davidson pulled her aside. "You're impressive, Maria," he said. "You have a way of seeing things others overlook." Maria smiled. "Years of being invisible will do that to you. You learn to pay attention." Davidson nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Have you ever considered taking a more active role in the company? With your skills, you could do a lot more than just influence decisions." Maria hesitated. The idea of stepping fully into the corporate world was daunting, but the opportunity was tempting. "I'll think about it," she said. While Maria considered her next move, Robert's frustration boiled over. He began making rash decisions, alienating key allies and pushing too hard for the merger to proceed. His behavior only served to validate Maria's concerns, and the board's trust in him eroded further. One evening, as Robert sat alone in his study, he poured himself a glass of whiskey and stared at a framed photo on his desk. It was an old picture of him as a young man, standing in front of a small, run-down apartment, the place where he had grown up. He had fought his way out of poverty, building a life of wealth and success. But somewhere along the way he had lost sight of the values that had driven him. For the first time in years, Robert felt a pang of doubt. Had his success made him blind to the struggles of others? Had his arrogance cost him more than just a deal? Maria's interview with the journalist was published the next week, and it quickly went viral. Titled "From Housekeeper to Boardroom: The Woman Who Outmaneuvered a Billionaire," the article detailed Maria's journey and highlighted her determination, intelligence, and resilience. The response was overwhelming. Messages poured in from people around the world, some congratulating her, others sharing their own stories of overcoming adversity. Maria read every message, her heart swelling with pride and gratitude. At the estate, the article caused a different kind of stir. The staff, who had always admired Maria but never fully understood her potential, were inspired by her story. Even those who had doubted her abilities couldn't help but feel a sense of awe. Robert, however, was livid. He read the article in his office, his face a mask of barely contained rage. "She's turned this into a circus," he muttered to himself. "I won't let her win." But as much as Robert hated to admit it, Maria had already won. Her story had shifted the narrative, casting her as the hero and him as the villain. The world was watching now, and there was little he could do to change that. The climax came at the next board meeting. Maria presented a comprehensive plan to restructure the company's operations, focusing on innovation and sustainability rather than a risky merger. Her proposal was met with enthusiasm, and the board voted unanimously to move forward with her vision. Robert sat in stunned silence as the votes were counted. His merger was officially off the table, and Maria's plan was now the company's future. The power he had wielded for so long was gone, and for the first time he felt truly humbled. After the meeting, Robert approached Maria in the hallway. His posture was less rigid, his tone less sharp. "Maria," he began, "I owe you an apology." Maria turned to face him, her expression calm but guarded. "For what?" "For everything," Robert said. "I underestimated you. I disrespected you. And I was wrong." Maria studied him for a moment before responding. "Apologies are a start, Mr. Sterling. But actions matter more." Robert nodded, understanding the weight of her words. "I'll do better." Maria nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Good. Because the world is watching." As the board meeting ended and Maria stepped out into the crisp evening air, a sense of triumph coursed through her veins. Yet she knew this wasn't the time to celebrate, not yet. She had managed to redirect the company's future, but there was still so much left to do. Maria drove home, her mind buzzing with ideas for the next steps. Her phone buzzed on the seat beside her, a notification lighting up the screen. It was a message from Davidson. Impressive work today. The board is behind you 100%. Let's discuss your ideas further next week. Maria allowed herself a small smile. For years she had been overlooked, treated as invisible. Now she was commanding the attention of powerful people who not only listened to her but valued her input. Meanwhile, back at the estate, Robert was pacing in his study. The defeat at the board meeting stung more than he cared to admit. For the first time in his life he felt outmaneuvered, powerless. The name Maria Alvarez echoed in his mind like a taunt. He poured himself another drink and sat heavily in his chair. His gaze landed on the framed photo of his younger self, the one he had stared at many nights before. The image was a stark reminder of where he had come from, a cramped, run-down apartment where every penny had been stretched to its limit. He had clawed his way out of that life, determined to never look back. But now looking back seemed unavoidable. Had he become the very type of person he once despised? Arrogant, dismissive, unwilling to see the worth in others? The thought gnawed at him, and for the first time in years, Robert felt a pang of self-doubt. Maria's rise wasn't without its challenges. As her story gained traction, not everyone was supportive. Online, there were detractors who questioned her legitimacy, accusing her of being a lucky opportunist rather than a savvy investor. At first, Maria tried to ignore the negativity, but the comments began to weigh on her. One evening, as she scrolled through the messages, Sophia wandered into the kitchen. "Mama, what are you looking at?" she asked, peeking over Maria's shoulder. Maria quickly closed the browser tab. "Nothing important, mi amor," she said, forcing a smile. "Are people being mean?" Sophia asked, her eyes wide with concern. Maria hesitated before nodding. "A little, but it's okay. Not everyone understands what I'm doing." Sophia climbed onto her lap, wrapping her small arms around Maria's neck. "You're amazing, Mama. Don't let them make you sad." Maria hugged her daughter tightly, her resolve strengthening. Sophia was her anchor, her reason for pushing forward. She couldn't let the negativity distract her from what truly mattered. The next morning, Maria received an unexpected call from a major investor. The man introduced himself as Jonathan Pierce, a venture capitalist who had been following her story with interest. "Ms. Alvarez," he said, his voice smooth and professional, "I've been impressed by your insights and strategy. I'd like to discuss a potential partnership." Maria's breath caught. A partnership with someone like Jonathan could open doors she hadn't even dreamed of. "I'd be happy to meet," she said, keeping her voice steady despite the excitement bubbling inside her. They arranged to meet later that week, and Maria spent every spare moment preparing. She read up on Jonathan's background, studied his past investments, and refined her own pitch. By the time the meeting came, she felt ready. The meeting took place in a sleek, modern office downtown. Jonathan was every bit as polished as Maria had expected, but he greeted her warmly, his handshake firm but friendly. "Thank you for meeting with me," Maria said as they sat down. "The pleasure is mine," Jonathan replied. "I've seen plenty of underdogs rise in the business world, but your story is something else entirely. You've got the tenacity and insight that can't be taught." Maria smiled, but she kept her focus. "I appreciate that, Mr. Pierce. And I think there's an opportunity here that could benefit both of us." As she laid out her vision, expanding the company's reach, fostering innovation, and creating opportunities for underserved communities, Jonathan listened intently. He asked thoughtful questions, his interest growing with each answer. By the end of the meeting, Jonathan leaned back in his chair, his expression one of admiration. "You've got a sharp mind and a big heart, Maria," he said. "I think we can do great things together." Maria left the office feeling lighter than she had in weeks. This was more than just a potential partnership. It was validation that her efforts were paying off. Back at the estate, Robert was dealing with a very different reality. His once loyal allies were beginning to distance themselves, wary of his erratic behavior and mounting failures. Even his assistant, who had always been unwavering in their support, seemed hesitant to challenge Maria's growing influence. One morning, Robert walked into the office to find his assistant sorting through papers with an uncharacteristically serious expression. "What's going on?" Robert demanded. The assistant hesitated. "It's about Maria," they said finally. "She's meeting with investors. Big ones. People who could shift the balance of power." Robert's face darkened. "She's building alliances?" The assistant nodded. "And they're taking her seriously. She's not just an obstacle anymore, Robert. She's a threat." The words hit Robert like a punch to the gut. He had spent years climbing to the top, building an empire he thought was untouchable. But now it felt like the foundation was crumbling beneath him. Meanwhile, Maria's influence continued to grow. With Jonathan's support, she began implementing her ideas on a larger scale, earning accolades from industry leaders and further cementing her position as a force to be reckoned with. At one of the company's new community initiatives, Maria gave a speech to a group of young entrepreneurs. As she spoke about resilience, determination, and the power of believing in oneself, she saw the same spark in their eyes that had driven her for so many years. "Success isn't about where you start," Maria said, her voice steady and inspiring. "It's about where you're willing to go and the work you're willing to put in to get there. Don't let anyone tell you what you're capable of." The applause that followed was deafening, and for the first time, Maria truly felt like she had found her calling, not just as a businesswoman, but as a leader who could inspire others to reach their potential. Maria's newfound partnership with Jonathan Pierce marked a turning point in her journey. Together, they worked on strategies to grow the company's influence while staying true to its values. Maria's focus on community-driven initiatives added a layer of authenticity that resonated with both employees and stakeholders. She was no longer just a shareholder or a strategist, she was becoming a symbol of change. Her presence was being felt across the industry, and word of her success began to spread. Articles and interviews painted her as a rising star, someone who had not only defied the odds but was actively reshaping the narrative around power and privilege. Each feature deepened Robert's growing sense of unease. One morning, as Maria walked into a board meeting, she felt a shift in the atmosphere. The usual tension when Robert was present seemed to have dissipated. Instead, there was a quiet sense of camaraderie among the members, as though they had finally begun to see Maria as an equal. Robert, however, wasn't about to let her dominate the room. He entered moments later, his presence still commanding, but there was a strain to his posture. He sat at the head of the table, his eyes scanning the faces around him before landing on Maria. "Let's get started," he said curtly, gesturing to the agenda. The discussion quickly turned to Maria's latest proposal, an initiative to diversify the company's portfolio by investing in smaller, innovative startups. It was a bold move, one that required a significant financial commitment but promised long-term benefits. "While the concept is intriguing," Robert began, his tone laced with skepticism, "I question whether it's the right time to take such risks. We've already deviated from the original strategy. Do we really need another gamble?" Maria didn't flinch. "It's not a gamble, Mr. Sterling. It's a calculated investment in the future. These startups are at the forefront of their industries. If we align with them now, we position ourselves as leaders in innovation rather than followers." The board members nodded, some murmuring their agreement. Robert's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. He knew she was right, and the evidence she presented left little room for argument. By the end of the meeting, the board had approved Maria's proposal, and Robert felt the weight of yet another loss. As the room emptied, he remained seated, staring at the table in silence. That evening, Robert retreated to his study, the walls of his once impervious world closing in around him. He poured himself a drink and sat in the dark, replaying the events of the past few weeks. His empire, built on years of hard work and unrelenting ambition, was slipping from his grasp. And the person dismantling it wasn't another corporate giant or a rival CEO. It was Maria Alvarez, the housekeeper he had dismissed as irrelevant. The irony wasn't lost on him. For all his wealth and power, Robert had overlooked the very qualities that had made him successful in the first place: resilience, ingenuity, and a refusal to be underestimated. Maria embodied all of these traits, and it was her tenacity that had brought him to this moment. But Robert wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. Meanwhile, Maria's life continued to evolve in ways she had never imagined. Her partnership with Jonathan had led to opportunities she once thought were out of reach, and her influence within the company was steadily growing. But despite her success, Maria remained grounded. She knew how quickly things could change, and she refused to let her guard down. One evening, as she sat at her kitchen table reviewing documents, Sophia walked in carrying a small, wrapped package. "Mama, this came for you," she said, placing it on the table. Maria looked at the package, her brow furrowing. There was no return address, only her name scrawled neatly on the label. She opened it cautiously, revealing a sleek black box. Inside was an expensive-looking fountain pen and a handwritten note. "Maria, this is just the beginning. Your story inspires us all. Keep writing your future. Jonathan." Maria smiled, running her fingers over the smooth surface of the pen. It was a thoughtful gesture, one that reminded her of how far she had come. But it also reignited her determination to keep pushing forward. At the next board meeting, Maria unveiled another ambitious plan, a mentorship program for young professionals from underserved communities. The initiative aimed to provide resources, training, and opportunities for those who lacked access to traditional pathways into the industry. This program isn't just about giving back, Maria explained, her voice steady and passionate. It's about finding untapped talent and bringing fresh perspectives into our company. Diversity isn't just a buzzword, it's a strength. The room was silent for a moment before one of the board members spoke up. "It's an excellent idea," she said. "This could position us as leaders in corporate responsibility." The rest of the board quickly voiced their agreement, and the proposal was approved unanimously. Robert once again found himself sidelined. He watched as Maria received congratulations and praise from his peers, the bitterness in his chest growing with every word. Despite his mounting frustrations, Robert wasn't ready to concede defeat. He began attending every meeting, scrutinizing every proposal, and looking for weaknesses in Maria's plans. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't find fault. Maria's ideas were thorough, her execution flawless. One afternoon, after a particularly heated exchange in the boardroom, Robert cornered Maria in the hallway. "You think you've won, don't you?" he said, his voice low but charged with anger. Maria turned to face him, her expression calm. "This isn't about winning or losing, Robert. It's about doing what's right, for the company, for the people who depend on it." Robert scoffed. "Spare me the noble act. You've been gunning for my position since the day you walked into that boardroom." Maria's gaze didn't waver. "I've been fighting for a better future, for myself and for my daughter. If that threatens you, maybe it's time to ask yourself why." For a moment, Robert didn't respond. Her words cut deeper than he cared to admit, and as she walked away, he was left standing in the hallway, his mind racing. Maria's mentorship program launched a few weeks later, and the response was overwhelming. Applications poured in from across the country, and Maria personally reviewed many of them, moved by the stories of resilience and determination that mirrored her own. At the program's kickoff event, Maria stood on stage, addressing a room full of eager young participants. "You all have something valuable to offer," she said. "Your ideas, your perspectives, your experiences, they matter. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." The audience erupted into applause, and as Maria looked out at the sea of hopeful faces, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. This was bigger than her, bigger than any one person. It was about creating a legacy that would outlast them all. The weeks that followed Maria's mentorship program launch were some of the most rewarding of her life. She had built something meaningful, something that didn't just serve her interests but uplifted others. Her name had become synonymous with resilience and progress, and for the first time she felt like she was truly making a difference. But Robert's resentment hadn't faded. If anything, it had grown. Every success Maria achieved felt like a personal failure to him, a reminder of how he had underestimated her. He began to isolate himself from the board, his frustration bubbling over into the smallest interactions. One evening, Robert sat alone in his study, staring at the framed photo of his younger self. He thought about the man he had been back then, hungry, determined, unwilling to let anyone look down on him. Somewhere along the way he had lost that fire, replacing it with arrogance and entitlement. And now he was paying the price. For the first time, Robert felt the weight of his mistakes. He thought about Maria, about the strength and determination she had shown despite everything he had thrown at her. She had outworked him, outsmarted him, and outshone him, not because she wanted to defeat him but because she had something bigger driving her. The next morning, Robert arrived at the office earlier than usual. He walked through the halls, greeting employees he had barely acknowledged before. He saw them differently now, not as cogs in a machine but as people with their own stories, struggles, and dreams. When he stepped into the boardroom, Maria was already there, discussing the mentorship program's next steps with Davidson. She looked up as Robert entered, her expression unreadable. "Maria," Robert said, his voice quieter than usual. "Could I have a word?" Maria exchanged a glance with Davidson, then nodded. "Of course." They stepped into an empty conference room, the tension between them palpable. Robert hesitated, the words he wanted to say caught in his throat. Finally he took a deep breath. "I've been wrong," he said simply. "About you, about how I've treated people, about a lot of things." Maria raised an eyebrow, her arms crossed. "Go on." Robert shifted uncomfortably. "I let my success blind me. I thought I had all the answers, that I didn't need to listen to anyone else. But you proved me wrong. You've done incredible things, not just for the company but for everyone around you." Maria studied him for a moment, her expression softening. "It takes courage to admit that," she said. But words only go so far, Robert. What are you going to do about it? Robert nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. I'm stepping down. Maria's eyes widened in surprise. What? I've thought about this a lot, Robert continued. The company needs someone who can lead it into the future, someone who understands what it means to innovate, to inspire. That's not me anymore. But it is you. Maria blinked, caught off guard. Are you serious? Completely, Robert said. You've earned it, Maria. And I think you'll do things with this company that I never could. For the first time, Maria saw sincerity in Robert's eyes. He wasn't just trying to save face, he truly believed in her. She nodded slowly, a small smile forming. Thank you, Robert. I won't let you down. A month later, Maria stood on the stage at the company's annual meeting, addressing employees, investors, and stakeholders. She had officially taken over as CEO, a position she had never imagined for herself but was determined to honor. As I stand here today, Maria began, her voice steady, I'm reminded of how far we've come, not just as a company but as individuals. We've faced challenges, but we've also found opportunities to grow, to change, and to make a difference. And that's what I want us to keep doing. The audience erupted into applause, the energy in the room electric. Maria glanced at Sophia, who was seated in the front row, beaming with pride. This was their moment, a culmination of years of hard work and sacrifice. Back at the estate, Robert watched the live stream of Maria's speech on his tablet. He sat on the balcony, the view of the city stretching out before him. For the first time in years he felt at peace. He had made mistakes, plenty of them, but he had also learned from them. And that, he realized, was what mattered most. As Maria's voice echoed through the speakers, Robert smiled. She'll do great things, he said to himself. She already has. Maria's journey didn't end with her new title. She continued to push for change, using her platform to advocate for inclusion, innovation, and empowerment. Her mentorship program expanded nationally, touching the lives of thousands. And through it all, she remained grounded, never forgetting the path that had brought her here. One day, as Maria left the office, she found Sophia waiting for her in the lobby. Mama, Sophia said, holding up a drawing, look, I made this for you. Maria took the drawing, her heart swelling. It was a picture of the two of them standing in front of a tall building with the words, Maria Alvarez, CO, written above the entrance. It's beautiful, mi amor, Maria said, kneeling to hug Sophia. And it's all because of you. No, Mama, Sophia said, her voice firm. It's because of you. Maria smiled, tears welling in her eyes. She had achieved more than she had ever dreamed, but her greatest accomplishment would always be the example she set for her daughter. As they walked out of the building together, hand in hand, Maria felt a deep sense of gratitude. She had started as a housekeeper, overlooked and underestimated. But she had risen above it all, proving that strength, determination, and a belief in one's worth could change the world. And she was just getting started.